My grandmother had a rule. She never threw anything away. Not the bone left over from Sunday's ham. Not the heel of a stale loaf of bread. Not the water she boiled her potatoes in, because that cloudy, starchy water went straight back into the soup pot. She raised 6 children on a coal miner's wages. She fed them through a depression. Through a war. Through years when there was more month left at the end of the money than anyone wanted to admit. And every single one of those 6 children grew up strong. Every single one of them remembered what her kitchen smelled like until the day they died. Here is what I want you to understand before we go any further. The meals I'm going to show you today, they were not born in poverty. They were born in wisdom. There is a difference. Poverty is a condition. Wisdom is what you do with it. These women, your grandmothers, your great-grandmothers, they didn't have nutrition labels. They didn't have dietitians or food blogs or $14 smoothies. They had a pot, a fire, and the knowledge that if they didn't figure out how to feed their family tonight, nobody else was going to do it for them. And what they figured out, modern science is only now catching up to. Stay with me. Because by the end of this video, you'll understand why these forgotten recipes are not relics. They are instructions. And some of them might be the most important meals you ever make. Right now, before we start, drop a comment below and tell me, what is the one dish your grandmother made that nobody in your family makes anymore? Just the name of it. I read every single one. Here is something that almost nobody talks about. Researchers studying the diets of people who lived through the Great Depression, and I mean people who actually thrived through the Depression, not just survived it, found something that genuinely surprised them. These people had lower rates of heart disease than their children's generation. Lower blood pressure. Lower rates of type 2 diabetes. Better gut health. And in many cases, longer lives. Not because they were lucky. Not because they had better medicine, they had almost no medicine. Because of what they ate. Dried beans. Bone broth. Fermented vegetables. Whole grains. Dark leafy greens cooked low and slow. Organ meats. Lard. Real butter. Nothing processed. Nothing packaged. Nothing made in a factory with ingredients you can't pronounce. The nutrition science community now has a term for what these women were doing accidentally. They call it the whole food dietary pattern. They charge $300 an hour to teach it in wellness clinics. Your grandmother called it Tuesday. And the specific magic wasn't just what they cooked. It was how. Low and slow. One pot. Long simmer times. Those methods don't just save energy and dishes. They break down compounds in legumes and grains that our bodies struggle to digest. They draw minerals out of bones into broth where our bodies can actually absorb them. They concentrate flavors that make simple food taste like something a person chose to eat, not something they settled for. So everything on this list today, every single recipe, comes with a reason. Not just a story. A reason. Because these meals earned their place at the table. And they deserve to be understood. Number 10, cabbage and potato boil. I want to start here because this is the meal that the Irish kept alive during the famine, the Eastern Europeans brought to tenement kitchens in Chicago, and the Appalachian families made every single winter for 100 years straight. 1 head of green cabbage. 4 potatoes. An onion. Water. Salt. A spoonful of butter at the end if you were lucky. You quartered the cabbage. You cut the potatoes into chunks. You dropped everything into a pot with just enough water to come halfway up the vegetables. Covered it. Let it go for 40 minutes on a low burner. The cabbage turned translucent and silky. The potatoes broke at the edges and thickened the broth. You mashed some of the potatoes right into the liquid, and suddenly you didn't have boiled vegetables anymore. You had a stew. Thick. Warming. Deeply satisfying in the way that only simple things can be. Modern nutritionists now know that cabbage is one of the most powerful anti-inflammatory vegetables on the planet. It contains compounds called glucosinolates that support liver function and reduce cancer risk. It feeds the gut microbiome. It's loaded with vitamin C and vitamin K. In 1935, nobody knew any of that. They just knew it cost 9 cents a head and kept the family fed. That is the whole point of this list. Number 9, onion broth soup. This recipe almost doesn't exist anymore. Not because it was bad. Because it was almost too simple to write down. 1 large pot of water. 4 or 5 onions, halved, skin and all. A bay leaf if you had one. Salt. That was the entire recipe. You set the onion halves directly on a dry cast iron pan until the cut faces turned deep brown, almost burned. Then into the pot with boiling water. 2 hours on a low simmer. What came out was a broth so dark it looked like beef stock. Deep, sweet, savory, with a complexity that made no sense given what went into it. The caramelized onions had done something extraordinary under heat. Their natural sugars transformed into something nutty and rich and real. Depression-era families drank this broth when there was nothing else. They poured it over stale bread to make it edible again. They sipped it from cups when they were sick. It was their Gatorade. Their medicine. Their comfort. And here is what science found out about it a century later. Onions are one of the richest dietary sources of quercetin, a compound now sold in capsules at $40 a bottle in health food stores. Quercetin reduces inflammation, lowers blood pressure, and supports immune function. When you simmer onions for hours, quercetin concentrates into the broth at levels you cannot get any other way. These women were drinking quercetin extract. They just called it soup. I want to pause for a second. If you grew up eating any version of either of these, the cabbage boil or the onion broth, type "I remember this" in the comments right now. Because I think there are more of us than we realize. Number 8, skillet cornbread and pot liquor. I have to stop and explain what pot liquor is, because if you didn't grow up in the South, you may have missed one of the most nutritionally extraordinary things ever cooked in an American kitchen. Pot liquor is the liquid left in the pot after you've slow-cooked collard greens or turnip greens or mustard greens with a piece of smoked pork. It's dark green, slightly smoky, deeply savory, and for generations of Southern families it was not the leftover, it was the prize. They would tear their cornbread into chunks and drown them in that pot liquor and eat it as a complete meal. Bread soaked in cooking liquid. The poorest food imaginable. And a complete nutritional profile that most modern meals cannot touch. The greens concentrated their calcium and iron and folate into that liquid. The pork bone released collagen and marrow. The cornbread added slow-burning complex carbohydrates. A single bowl had more micronutrients than most modern convenience meals can deliver in a week. Huey Long, the governor of Louisiana in the 1930s, once gave a speech on the Senate floor defending pot liquor as the greatest food in America. He was right. He was just wrong about everything else. I want to stop the list for a moment. Because I think there's something happening in these recipes that goes deeper than nutrition. Deeper than budget. Deeper than any of the practical reasons we keep talking about. These meals were made by people who cooked for someone. They were made in kitchens where the table was full, where there were arguments and laughter and children who wouldn't eat their beans and husbands who came home smelling like the mill. And then the kitchens got quiet. Children grew up and moved away. The husbands went first, the way they usually do. And suddenly you are standing at a stove making a pot of something for one person, in a kitchen that used to echo with noise, and the silence has a weight to it that no recipe can fix. I know some of you watching this know exactly what I'm talking about. These recipes were not just about filling a belly. They were about the act of cooking itself. The ritual of it. Standing at a stove and doing something with your hands. Creating something from almost nothing. Sitting down at a table, not the couch, not in front of the television, but at a table, and eating a meal you made yourself. That act, that small, quiet act, is one of the most powerful things a person living alone can do for their own health and dignity. Not because of what's in the bowl. Because of who put it there. Number 7, lentil soup with vinegar. The vinegar is the secret. I'll get to that. A cup of dried green or brown lentils. 1 onion, diced. 2 cloves of garlic. A carrot. A can of diced tomatoes. Water. Salt. That is the whole ingredient list, and it costs less than $1.50 to assemble. You sweat the onion and garlic in whatever fat you had, lard, a bit of butter, later it became vegetable oil, until the onion went translucent and soft. Then the carrot. Then the tomatoes. Then the lentils and enough water to cover them by 2 inches. 35 minutes on a medium simmer. No soaking required. That was the glory of lentils. Unlike every other dried bean, they cooked fast enough to be a weeknight meal. And then, right at the end, just before serving, a splash of apple cider vinegar. Most people leave this out now. It was the thing that made the Depression-era version extraordinary. The vinegar hit the soup and brightened every single flavor in the pot. The earthiness of the lentils. The sweetness of the carrot. The acid of the tomatoes. Everything came into focus, the way your eyes adjust when you walk from a dark room into sunlight. And here is the nutritional kicker that nobody knew about in 1930. Adding acid, vinegar, lemon juice, tomato, to legumes significantly increases the bioavailability of the non-heme iron they contain. Which means your body absorbs more iron from the lentils because of the acid. Not less. More. These women were accidentally optimizing mineral absorption through acid-base chemistry at the dinner table. They called it making it taste good. Scientists call it enhancing iron bioavailability. The soup doesn't know the difference. It's just extraordinary. Number 6, true bone broth. Made the old way. Not the kind in a carton from the grocery store. Not the kind in a $12 can from the health food section. The kind that takes 3 hours and turns your entire house into something that feels like a memory. Depression-era grandmothers didn't make bone broth because they read a wellness blog. They made it because throwing away a chicken carcass was unthinkable. When the meat was gone, the bones went back in the pot. Feet if they had them. Necks. Wings. Whatever the butcher had that nobody else wanted, they got for almost nothing. Cold water. A splash of vinegar to pull the minerals from the bones. Vegetables. Time. 8 to 12 hours for a serious batch. 3 to 4 hours minimum for something that counts. What comes out is a liquid that gels when it cools. That gelling is the collagen. The glycine. The proline. The compounds that support joint health, gut lining integrity, skin elasticity, and inflammation reduction. The collagen supplement industry is worth $4 billion a year. It sells you back in powder form what your grandmother simmered out of a chicken carcass for 11 cents. Drink a cup of this every morning for a month. Not for the trend. Because every grandmother who lived past 90 with her mind intact was drinking it her whole life and never knew why it worked. Number 5, sausage and bean stew with day-old bread. The bread is not a side dish. The bread is the point. 1 ring of smoked sausage, the kind that cost $1 and lasted all week because you used it in small amounts. A can of white beans. A can of diced tomatoes. An onion. 2 cloves of garlic. Water. And the heel of a loaf of bread that was 2 days old and going stale. You dropped that bread into the finished stew in large torn chunks. Covered the pot for 5 minutes. The bread absorbed the broth and dissolved at the edges and became part of the soup itself, thickening it, enriching it, turning a simple stew into something that ate like a full meal even when there was nothing else on the table. In Italy they called this ribollita, reboiled bread soup. In Spain they called it sopa de ajo. In France it was soup au pain. In rural Oklahoma they called it Thursday supper. Every culture that ever had poor people, which is every culture, always, figured out independently that old bread plus liquid plus heat equals something worth eating. The human solution to scarcity is the same in every language. That's not coincidence. That's genius. I want to say something that might sound a little uncomfortable. The foods on this list, dried beans, potatoes, cabbage, lentils, onions, whole grains, bone broth, they are not on television commercials. You will not see a celebrity posting about cabbage and potato boil on Instagram. No wellness influencer is building a brand around split pea soup. And here's why that matters. There is no profit margin in a bag of dried lentils. Nobody can put their name on an onion. The markup on a head of cabbage is pennies, and no amount of rebranding is going to change that. So the food industry doesn't tell you about these things. The supplement industry doesn't tell you about these things. Because you cannot build a billion-dollar company on the truth that the most nutritious meal you can eat costs less than $2 and takes 40 minutes to make on a stove your grandmother would recognize. People who had the least knew the most. And we have spent 60 years trying to sell that knowledge back to them at a markup. I think that's worth being a little angry about. Number 4, chicken thigh and rice. 1 pot. 1 hour. No apology. Chicken thighs are the most unfairly dismissed cut of meat in the American grocery store. For decades, the industry convinced us that white meat was better. Boneless, skinless, flavorless. Easy to overcook. Dry at the edges. Expensive. Your grandmother knew what she was doing. Thighs browned in their own fat. Then a cup of long-grain rice went into the same pot, absorbing the drippings. Then a can of chicken broth, or homemade broth if you had it, poured over everything. A bay leaf. Salt. Pepper. The lid went on and it simmered for 30 minutes on low. When the lid came off, the rice had absorbed every drop of liquid. The thighs were dark and tender. The fat from the thighs had worked its way through the entire pot, coating every grain of rice with a richness you cannot manufacture in a factory and cannot replicate with a boneless skinless breast. The bones released collagen into the rice as it cooked. The dark meat stayed moist because it had enough intramuscular fat to survive the heat. And the flavor. The flavor was the taste of someone who understood what they were doing. For a senior living alone, this pot lasted 3 days. Day 1, ate it straight from the pot. Day 2, the rice had absorbed even more flavor and it was better cold than it was hot. Day 3, scrambled an egg into the leftover rice in the same pan. 1 chicken. 3 dinners. Less than $4. Number 3, navy bean soup. The most American meal nobody makes anymore. The United States Senate cafeteria has served navy bean soup every single day since 1903. Not most days. Every single day. The reason is simple. Senator Fred Du Bois of Idaho insisted on it in 1903 because it was the meal he grew up on, and he saw no reason why becoming a senator should change that. And once it was on the menu, it stayed. Because everyone who grew up without money recognized it as the taste of home. A 2-pound bag of dried navy beans. 1 large onion. 3 stalks of celery. A ham bone if you had one, a ham hock if you didn't. Water. Salt. Pepper. A bay leaf. A splash of vinegar at the end. 2 hours on a low simmer. You came back to a pot where the beans had burst open and released their starch into the broth, thickening it to the consistency of a thin porridge. The ham hock had given up every ounce of its smoky flavor. The celery and onion had dissolved into the background, present in the taste but invisible to the eye. You could pull the ham hock out, shred the meat off the bone, stir it back in. Or you could leave the pot vegetarian and add a teaspoon of smoked paprika at the end to get that same depth without the meat. A 2-pound bag of navy beans costs $1.89. It makes enough soup to feed one person for an entire week. The protein content per serving rivals a chicken breast. The fiber content rivals any supplement on the market. The cost per serving is 27 cents. Tell me that's not the most important recipe in this video. Number 2, stewed apples. The forgotten dessert. I put this on the list because I think we have forgotten that poor people also ate dessert. Not cakes. Not pies. Not anything that required an oven and a full hour and a list of ingredients. But dessert. When the apple tree in the yard had more fruit than a family could eat fresh, they stewed them. When the apples in the cellar were starting to go soft and wrinkle, they stewed them. When someone was sick and couldn't keep solid food down, they stewed them. 10 minutes on medium heat. The apples collapsed into a thick, glossy, cinnamon-scented compote that was warm and soft and sweet in the way that only cooked fruit can be. You ate it plain in a bowl. You spooned it over oatmeal. You put it on a piece of bread. You served it alongside pork as a condiment. For a senior with dental issues, stewed apples were a gift. Soft, sweet, requiring no chewing. Loaded with pectin, which feeds gut bacteria. Naturally anti-inflammatory. And the most comforting thing in the world when you were eating alone and needed something that tasted like a treat. Your grandmother made this because apples went soft. Her grandmother made it because sugar was the only luxury they could sometimes afford. And both of them would be baffled and a little sad that we stopped making it. Make it this week. It takes 12 minutes. You probably have everything you need right now. Number 1, chicken soup. The only recipe that has never, not once, let anyone down. Every culture on earth has this recipe. Every single one. The Chinese have it with ginger and scallions. The Mexicans have it with lime and chili. The Jews have it with matzo and dill. The Italians have it with pasta and parmesan. The Southern Americans have it with dumplings. They all arrived at the same pot independently. Because chicken soup is not a recipe. It is a human instinct. A whole chicken in cold water. Low heat. Long time. The heat does everything. The collagen dissolves out of the joints. The fat rises to the surface and is skimmed away, leaving a broth that is pure and golden and alive. The vegetables surrender everything they have. 2 hours later, the house smells like a grandmother lives there. Not your grandmother specifically, maybe. But someone's grandmother. Someone who knew that a pot on the stove is the oldest promise in the world. For a senior living alone, there is something specific I want to say about this meal. When you make it for yourself, just for yourself, in a quiet kitchen, on a slow Tuesday afternoon, you are doing something the world does not always tell you that you deserve. You are telling yourself that you are worth the trouble of cooking. That a 2-hour simmer is worth it for one bowl. That. The whole ritual of it, the smell filling the house, the steam on the windows, sitting down with a bowl and a spoon and a piece of bread, that all of it is worth it even when there is nobody across the table. Especially when there is nobody across the table. The broth is warm. The chicken is tender. The carrot is soft. And somewhere in the smell of it, you remember that you learned this from someone who loved you. And that the fact that you still make it, that you still stand at that stove and make it for yourself, is a way of saying that their love is still worth honoring. That is what chicken soup is. That is what all of these recipes are. These recipes are not sad. They were never sad. They were made by women who had every reason to give up and didn't. Who stood at stoves on the worst days of their lives and made something warm and nourishing out of almost nothing. That's not poverty. That's power. Here is what I want you to do. This week, just this week, make one of these. The chicken soup, the lentil stew, the navy bean soup, the stewed apples. Pick one. Make it. Sit down at your table. Not the couch. The table. And if you have a recipe from your own grandmother that should be on a list like this, one that nobody in your family makes anymore, I want you to write it in the comments. Not just the name. The story. Where did it come from? Who taught her? What it smelled like when she made it. Because these recipes deserve to be remembered. And the women who made them deserve to be remembered. And the fact that they kept their families alive and healthy on almost nothing, that deserves more than to be forgotten. Subscribe if you want more of this. We are going to keep finding these recipes and telling these stories for as long as there are stories left to tell. And there are so many left to tell.